My name is Sue Shaw. I am the staff trainer at the ARC. And I have been in the field for since end of 1989. I've spent a lot of my time supporting people with extensive behavior and medical needs, done a lot of staff training. And in the last 7.5 years, I've had 8 young adults in my home who have been at risk in the community. So lots of different experiences. And please ask us questions. Let us know what supports you as we go through.
Hi, I'm Leanna Sanders. I'm the therapist at the St. Louis ARC. I've been working at the ARC for about 5 years now in different capacities, and then in the field for about 9 years.
Yeah, hello, my name is Georgia Cuss, and I work at the St. Louis ARC as the Director of Quality and Training. I've been in the field off and on since 2008. I've been at the ARC since 2015. And I've worked in residential services at the ARC, as well as day services, and have been working on the same team with Sue in quality and training for the past almost 2 years. But I know Sue's going to be our screen sharer, so she'll walk us through some slides.
Are you ready?
And we're excited to talk to you. So I'm going to kick us off with our first tool, although something that Sue will have we were talking about right before you all joined is that we really ended up expanding this a little bit to slightly more than 4 tools to help with safety and healing as we talk about those topics. But first is one you may be familiar with. It is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Abraham Maslow is a theorist who developed this hierarchy in 1943, so it's been around for a while. It basically just outlines the basic needs of humans, typically visualized as a pyramid, where we have to take care of these base needs toward the bottom of the pyramid before we can start taking care of some of our higher functioning needs a little further up. There are some other ways to conceptualize that, but you can really see where these needs at the bottom do become extremely important. It's really hard to focus on love and belonging and the relationships in our life if we are unhoused and we don't have somewhere we're sleeping. Not impossible, but harder. So the build that this includes are physiological needs here at the bottom: air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, and then reproductive needs eventually in life. There are safety needs like personal security, employment, resources, health, property, emotional safety falls into here. There's love and belonging, which gets into our relationships that we build. So friendship, as well as intimate relationships, family or other, found family, chosen family, as well as biological family, and then a sense of connection. And then you get into some of the things like self-esteem, where you're really feeling confident with yourself. You're able to build some of those skills and those lenses, respect, status, recognition. People know who you are. You're feeling like you've been able to build an identity, strength, and then freedom to exercise your rights and who you want to be. And then there's this sort of pinnacle that's often depicted of self-actualization. We'll start out by talking about just a few examples that really highlight some of the safety pieces that are important. But when we think about some of the physiological needs and the safety needs upon which this builds, we can think about examples like a little boy who suddenly has started at school putting spaghetti in his pocket, and he's walking around and we're not sure why he's doing this. And so the right person asks him a question, and he shares that his new boyfriend doesn't at the house, and so he's been more and more hungry. So he was saving the spaghetti for later so that he would have a snack. So you can really see how this would cause problems in the classroom. He's going to get teased. He might get in trouble. He's going to spill spaghetti on the floor and really be noticed more. But it also was a very adaptive behavior for the situation that he was in. He was finding ways to get his physiological needs met. You can think about a teenage girl living with a foster family. a situation that has come up where they got the family got a new puppy. The parents in this home had a spat in the living room about how to take care of the puppy, which is a normal thing to do. This teenager ran out of the house. The new foster mom followed and tried to ask the right follow-up questions, which is a theme of asking the right follow-up. Asked what was wrong and found out that in the previous living situation, every time two people in the house started yelling at each other, the cops were always called. So she had to get out at the start of the argument in order to avoid being there when that chaos ensued. And so you can again see how that was really adaptive behavior for her in her previous setting. But if she keeps doing that in life every time tension or conflict enters a room that she is sharing with other people, she could start to get in trouble in school. We'll call it eloping. It's a very weird behavior if you get into a professional setting. It's not going to lead to the best chance of success. So it's worth taking care of as an emotional safety need as soon as someone can help identify it and give this person the right supports. We also have examples certainly of folks with disabilities that we support, like someone that we know who used to hide snack wrappers in their room, and that was confusing for a while, but turns out that they had just moved in with us into a group home where they were living before. They were not allowed to have snacks without prior approval, even when they were hungry, yet again, and so they were afraid of getting in trouble. And so that's another conversation worth having to really identify where these behaviors that seem a little strange, a little maladaptive are coming from, identify how they actually are adaptive, and then support that person with meeting whatever need they have going on, so that they can move forward in a positive way. And being understanding if they need to live in that space for a while and keep snacks in their room protected. We transition it to someone has a snack drawer in their room, they feel that security, they can live that way for a while, and then transition when they're ready or not. And it's okay not to be ready to transition from that. If that's what you need to feel safe, then that's okay. So those are the types of things that we're thinking about in some of these base safety categories. And I think the highlights of why it's important is that it's worth asking follow-up questions always to see where someone's coming from. Be curious, not judgmental, which is sort of a Ted Lasso like hat tip. And then to be thinking ahead about big transitions in life that are certainly part of what might lead to scarier moments for someone where their behavior starts to switch a little bit, and we can be ready to look out for and support them.
Good. And I think about in self-actualization that, we might hit that and we might be living there and then something could suddenly happen. About 2 years ago now, I meant to pay my water bill, which I believe was $52.38. And the decimal didn't get in there, and I paid $5,238 to the water company, which is about 10 years worth of water. People told me I should get a swimming pool, but it took me a month to get that money back. And when I checked in, my bank account was overdrawn. And believe me, I wasn't living at self-actualization that day. I was right back to how am I going to pay my bills, right?
Yeah.
So, if you're supporting someone and they end up in the hospital or something, they lose their job, they're not going to be living in that top of that pyramid. They're going to move right back down to, am I safe? How am I going to pay my bills? What does that look like? So it's something to watch because you might think, well, why is this person struggling? They may have had something happen that knocks them back down to just looking at, are my needs being met? So
it is worth noting that Abraham Maslow, the theorist, spent that summer when he was 30, living in Western Canada, east of Calgary in Alberta, living with the Siksika Nation and studying some of their First Nations behaviors and attitudes about the world and lenses that they use. He published his hierarchy in 1943, a few years later. And although the Siksika people are often, who are in English, that is the Blackfoot Nation, are often not credited with having influenced his theories, it's pretty well established that a lot of the ways that they think about human relationships ended up influencing the direction that he went with his humanistic approach. So that includes things like what he observed as a much higher rate of persons who were self-actualized than in Western culture among the Siksika people. So there's a word for that in Siksika, which means someone who is completely developed or someone who has arrived. So he ended up also observing some of the interplay of the dynamics that led to that self-actualization. And there is a more modern scholar who is also a First Nations individual, Cindy Blackstock of the Gitxsan tribe, who developed this graphic to help sort of think about that. That demonstrates some of the differences where on the left, you have the Western worldview, which is a lot more linear. You have a child who lives within a family system, who eventually operates within a workplace system, and then societal pieces. But an Indigenous worldview, according to Ms. Blackstock, is a lot less linear and a lot more about the interconnectedness and communal elements of human existence. So you see how it has a child, community, and world at center, and then sort of a Venn component where you have spiritual elements of identity and functioning, emotional elements of identity and functioning playing together with community very much at the center. So I think it's the community element of that is really interesting and important, and connects to yet one other example of how we can sort of think about some of these needs and the interplay therein, which is on the next slide as well. So this is the idea of Ubuntu, which has made its way into pop culture in the US in the last several years, but it's an example of collectivism. It's rooted in a variety of African cultures. So the word Ubuntu and a few variations of it span 18 different languages across 13 countries in Africa. And the idea of it is highly community oriented. So it can, in some translations, be interpreted as I am because we are. And so a proverb that's kind of a fun visual that is often used to describe the concept tells the story of a group of school children who were at one point being researched by a Western anthropologist. The proverb just says African children. It doesn't specify more narrowly, but it says that when these kids were tasked to run a race in order to win a piece of fruit, they held hands and decided to work together and cross the finish line all at the same time. And when asked why they didn't compete for the fruit, for the prize, they stated, "How could I be happy when the rest are sad?" And so that community emphasis, I think, is really meaningful when we think about safety, which very much includes emotional well-being and safety and healing, because all of us really need that community and connection in ways that our Western culture doesn't always emphasize, but we still feel it, right? And then also most of us find joy and meaning in contributing to our community. So if we're looking for ways to sort of continue self-actualizing, right, then including people with disabilities, that it's important looking for ways to contribute so that even when people aren't, even if society isn't pushing this for us or doesn't have high expectations for us to be able to contribute in that way, it makes a big difference. Sue, did you have some other thoughts on that piece, or Leanna?
No, I just think it is, we've lost some of that sense of community in the States, and in losing it, we've lost that connection, and people will become isolated. And the more isolated we are, the less options we see. And I think we'll talk about that more as we go through.
Yeah.
And I definitely feel like part of that community, just working in different capacities at the ARC, seeing a lot of families who do have loved ones who have a disability, there tends to be that isolation component where you are doing this and you don't really have any community, where I know the ARC really tries to emphasize helping people with that and creating that community and helping families meet. So I think also throughout the lifespan, we do that with our residential setting as well as day programs. So just trying to build that community can always be helpful.
Mhm. And looking for ways that we don't realize we are isolating our loved ones with disabilities, with really good intentions, but then suddenly realizing, you know what, my loved one is exclusively in programs with other people with disabilities and not really spending time with other people without disabilities, or thinking about other identity characteristics that someone in your life might not have had exposure to, people whose backgrounds and identities look really different than your family's or something like that, which is yet a further challenge, but definitely on the self-actualization list of things that make a big difference.
Right. So this is the crisis cycle. As we all kind of know, whenever we have intense emotions, we have this baseline, and then something might trigger us. So you're even with paying your water bill.
Yeah.
Pennies worth that. That is a very triggering event. So I feel like with that, there is definitely the triggering event and escalation. And then the peak where we just cannot. I know there have been times where I've felt very anxious and I'm not able to take in information. That's kind of when we're out of our baseline, we're in a red zone. Um, it takes some time to calm down, and sometimes we do need to hit that peak in order to come down. So we have a de-escalation, settling, and then recovery, and that's usually exhaustion. Um, I recently moved, and for me, change is kind of anxiety provoking for me. So I feel like I had that escalation phase of kind of panic and needing to get things done. And then the week after, I was in recovery and really exhausted. I'm sure, Sue, you probably, once you got your money back, it was like, wow, I need to rest. Um, I deserve to rest. Because our anxiety, and whenever we are in that heightened state, our body is pumping a lot of hormones. We're really on edge. We're in that fight or flight mode. So that recovery is really important in letting your body just listen to it and recover, and then returning to baseline. A lot of the folks that we do support might have a higher baseline if they do have a diagnosis of anxiety or another mental illness, or if they're IDD diagnosis or developmental diagnosis may also cause a lot of anxiety. So I really like to picture it as maybe we're meeting somebody at a higher baseline. So their trigger might be something that we might see as small, but it might be something like, oh my gosh, this is not what I wanted for lunch. I've had a really hard day. This is not something I wanted. I worked with an individual a few years ago in my first job out of school, and I didn't know that he wasn't getting food at home, and I made his mac and cheese and it was not the way he liked it. So he got really, really upset and threw the bowl. But later I found out that this was really his only meal of the day and he just wanted it the way he wanted it. So really letting him have that input while we were making his lunch for the day. And then after that happened, he needed that recovery time. So we cleaned up, and then he just needed to rest for a little bit. And then we returned back to baseline really the next day. Sometimes that recovery time can take pretty long. All right. Does anybody have any questions, or would you guys like to add anything?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit. Just, when that trigger happens, if we can remove it, if we know what it is, like if it's the roommate, maybe they take a walk and that person then gets a chance to move on with their day. But I always say this looks like a mountain on this piece of paper, and it's really, or on the screen, it's really not. It's going to look probably more like a mountain range, because they may start to calm down, and then somebody else or something else may happen, and they may escalate again, or even roommate comes back. But as they get more upset, they're not going to be able to see options in their life. So what our job is to really know when they're at baseline, what do they like? What kinds of things can we help them with? And when then they are starting to get upset, we could say, and a lot of times it's an active thing that helps because they're physically agitated. So, let's go shoot some hoops or let's take a walk. But then as they get to the point where they're not listening anymore and they're really in crisis, if that happens, ideally, they're not going to get to that point. We're going to give them some space. We're going to back off. They're not going to be hearing us anyway. So as long as they're safe, and no one else is unsafe, we're going to back off, give them space, give them time to calm down. As they start to do that, they may feel really, guilty about getting upset, losing control. They may feel like they maybe ruined their relationship with you. So at that point, we're going to come back and start empathizing, ask yes questions, say, I'm here for you, I care about you, just reinforce that relationship. And then as they settle, that's when you're going to hear the story. So, boy, so many times. And one of the young men that stayed with me, he would ask to run errands, and I would know, oh, by about the time we're done with the errands, he's going to start telling me what's going on in his head. That's when you hear that story. And what's nice about that story is it tells you what that trigger was in the first place. So next time, maybe you'll know what it is and you don't have to go through the whole process. But listen to that. And the other thing I found that's really helpful is instead of sitting across the table from someone or looking at them, sit in the car next to them or take a walk next to them or sit on the couch next to them. And they're going to tell you that story more than if you sit and look at them. Usually I just it was a lot better experience. There were several times I ended up sitting in the car for over an hour after we got home because I knew if we left the car, that would end. And then recovery is just, making sure they're okay. Probably they've already talked to you and told you the story. So it's big picture. If they hit the wall, is there swelling? Are they hurt? Are they breathing okay? Is everything okay? And then returning to baseline.
We had a question in the chat also, Sue, that was do you and Leanna, but just Sue was talking. That do you ever find that caregivers escalate and peak themselves?
Yes.
Yes.
Once
all
they've
the
had time
time.
to process the situation. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Absolutely.
feel like that's a situation where it's really hard not to be emotionally involved and peak as well. A lot of times I know when I've been in situations where somebody is very escalated, I really try to focus on being calm myself. Because whenever we're escalated, that person's going to keep escalating as well. And kind of like what Sue was saying, sit with them. I had a person I was working with a little bit ago, and I had no idea why they were so escalated. They came in and they were very upset. I just sat with them in silence for about an hour while they were going through their crisis. And then we were able to go through that recovery phase.
One thing that helps me a lot is thinking about whose crisis is this? So a lot of times I escalate, of course, because somebody else is in crisis, but take a deep breath. Whose crisis is this? It's not mine. And I'm here to help them through it. And that helps me keep myself from escalating, because if I start escalating, I'm not going to see options. It's kind of like when you're escalating, it's almost like you get blinders put on. You don't see other things out there. And if I'm, as the caregiver, also escalated, neither one of us is seeing those options, and then worse things are going to happen. So if I can calm myself down so I can see options and help them through it, it's going to be a lot more effective process.
Yeah, I think you made a great point in saying whenever we're escalated, we also can't hear or see any options. That kind of helps with the frame of mind when another person is escalated. They're not going to be able to see options. They're just going to be upset, like we are. So I think Sue, you made a really good point in pointing out that we'll also not be able to see the options and really be able to think calmly. So always something to remember.
Well, and if somebody gets to like the point where they're really escalated, like that upper escalation, they're not going to be able to make a decision. If I say, do you want to do a puzzle or take a walk? I may just have to say, hey, let's go do this. Or even if they grabbed a chair and they're threatening to throw it at me, hey, throw it at the wall. That's not what I want them to do, but it's better than throwing it at me.
And with the original question as it was framed, also I see the time frame that you mentioned where the idea is that maybe the caregiver is also getting escalated later on after the person you're supporting is at their baseline again, and then you amp up because it was hard and it was stressful, and secondary trauma is something you're experiencing with that, especially if it's recurring things like this. And so that's also where you acknowledging that it's happening is really good, like paying attention to your body and that response, and then seeking support, whatever that looks like for you, including, you know, resources for fixing the system where this is a recurring thing, if it is, or just that personalized debriefing that you might need, all those types of things.
I did see a question in the chat. In the recovery phase, I find my loved one says things like they feel stupid for it even happening once they realize it happened. So any tips? So a lot of times whenever I have worked with people and they're telling me things like this, we really try to affirm their feelings and just say, no, you had a really, really hard time before this, and that's okay. It's okay to express your emotions. I'm here to support you. We're going to figure out how we can work through this, and also what ways can we communicate later on. I think affirming that the situation was really hard, that they may have been triggered by, that way they don't feel like they overreacted, especially if they are practicing how to be calm and how to communicate when they have been triggered.
And that's definitely not a time to say, well, you should have done this. It's a time to to empathize with them. So I'm sorry that happened. That must have been really hard, just like Leanne is saying. And let's wait until their return to baseline. Maybe tomorrow morning, we're going to talk about, wow, that was really hard and you made some decisions, and let's talk about those decisions. But we're not going to do that while they might escalate again because they're still upset.
Right. So kind of like Sue was saying, that the crisis cycle is like one big mountain. But really it's kind of like a bunch of mountains, a bunch of peaks. So emotions are like waves. Whenever a big emotion comes, I always try to explain it as like, it's good to acknowledge it, acknowledge what's triggering you, acknowledge what's happening. Along the way, we learn that we can communicate about it in different ways to feel calm and at ease when that triggering situation might be happening. But it might come back. So kind of like what Georgia and Sue were saying is somebody may be in that recovery phase and that trigger comes right back. So the wave just happens again. So really kind of understanding that this isn't a one-time thing. And it's also not going to be permanent. So we're not going to be in that crisis phase constantly. It's going to be a wave. We're going to come back down, but it's very likely it might happen again. And also learning ways to cope and healthily communicate is a huge piece of that. I know I practice a lot of that with people, and really learning how, okay, when does my body feel a certain way? When does it feel like it's been triggered? What does my body feel like after that? How can I communicate what I need? What can I do instead of getting really angry and throwing something? Should I go take a walk? So really kind of redirecting somebody can be really helpful, especially if you know what that trigger is. But if we're already in the crisis phase, how can we help somebody know their body and awareness to the point where they can communicate, hey, I'm about to have a crisis?
There is Dr. Siegel. If you look up hand model of the brain, it's something you can find online on YouTube. And basically what it is it's looking at your wrist and your arm coming up, or the brainstem. You can find it on there, but this is like the alarm that goes off in your brain, and then this is the higher brain function. And if somebody gets really upset, it's like they blow their top, and all that happens is that alarm goes off. And so if you look that up, you can see his view of it. But it's helpful because especially children will have them say, I'm blowing my top, and that gives you a chance to intervene before it actually happens.
So kind of going back to what Georgia was saying originally with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, really need to communicate and also have a group of people, our support system. A lot of times I think about IEPs. That's a huge support system. Um, Families are huge support systems. So really trying to find a way to communicate through space. So what I really like to envision, I worked at a school for children with autism for a while, and whenever I'd have somebody who was in that crisis coming into my classroom, I would turn out the lights. We would just hang out in silence, let them kind of get their crisis over with and kind of go into the recovery phase. So I know a lot of us, whenever we're really anxious and can't listen to any options, we don't want people coming into our face and saying, you need to stop. What do you want to do? So I really try to picture, all right, I'm going to give this person space, give them space to say what they need, give them space to get through that cycle. And also give them space to come back down, especially if people being close to them is triggering. I really try to do pictures or social stories, especially if somebody is really heightened. A lot of times words are going to be really hard to listen to. So sometimes if it's been a while, I might write something down or do a social story and just hold it up. I've seen that work with some students. In counseling, I really try to work on learning how to cope in healthy ways. So this can include ways to express their inner crisis. I worked with somebody who I made a laminated stop sign, and as soon as they started feeling their body get really anxious, we would talk about their tummy hurting. They would hold up the stop sign and they would be able to go get a break. So really finding creative ways to support that person when there's a trigger, when there's a crisis. And eventually that would be able to kind of turn into healthy ways. And it might take a long time, but I think having that support system that knows ways to help this person cope is really helpful. If anybody would like to add anything, they're welcome to.
No, that was great. We have a question as well about a couple questions. So one is, do you have go-to prompts to get someone to describe the emotion they're having? Or are the pictures you mentioned more effective? I expect that some of that in your work.
Yeah, I have lots of pictures, lots of laminated things that have pictures of emotions that somebody can point to. So that way, if they're just super angry and not able to talk, they have something that they can show me. So that's been really, really effective. I know one person I worked with had a little flip book that if they were really angry, they could just flip to whatever emotion they were at. And this is at a phase where they were very used to using this and just show people that were supporting them.
I had a follow-up question with that one, Leanna.
Yeah.
Do you have any go-to phrases that often are helpful for just like getting people in the mindset of opening up to sharing their emotions? Or is it more about building that relationship over time and finding the right communication strategy, etc.?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. So I think really finding that person's communication strategy, but also not saying too much. I think having one sentence with a couple words is perfect. Like, I had one person who was very escalated and just said, "What do you need? What can I do?" And it's making it more about what can I do versus putting any type of blame on that person. So, or any type of responsibility in that moment. It's more, what can I do to support you? And that will kind of lead to some opening up. If that doesn't work, that's usually when I show the emotion chart and just kind of like, hey, like, what are you feeling? And a lot of times they can't express what happened before. So that's kind of when they're in that crisis. And after, I know I had somebody who was in crisis for a couple hours, and I found out they wanted to go get Church's chicken and they weren't allowed to before. So that like, oh, that would have been good to know. I would have just tried to get that for you. But really trying to find those open-ended questions, very simple sentences are really helpful.
No, they also say most of us only really recognize 6 emotions. And so, anger is always a secondary emotion. So if we can help somebody recognize that they're sad or they're frustrated or some of those other things, that's going to help a lot, because then we know what's going on. And if we can say, hey, looks like you get embarrassed when this happens. if I say, are you embarrassed? They're going to be defensive. But if it looks like you might get embarrassed when this happens, hey, next time that happens, why don't you come let me know and we'll get some space or whatever.
Yes. And it's like make it a team effort. Like, how about we go do this? That way you're in it together, they feel supported instead of saying, hey, how about you go take some space? I think that that's a really big piece. Any type of verbal thing like that can be really helpful. Oh, and then how can parents document those coping strategies? I think trying to document if you used one, if you've tried one, trial and error, really talking through it with your loved one after, or even showing pictures if that person is not able to talk through it. Just say like was giving like space and have a picture of somebody like alone in a room, or going on a walk, have a picture of somebody going on a walk. So I think that's a good way to kind of help that person document like, hey, this is also your choice as well and what worked.
So this is something that we're actually putting together right now. So I was supporting someone in my home and he had lost like everything, all of his connection. He had been moved in from another city and then he made some relationships at school, but due to some things that happened, he wasn't able to be there. And he lost the connections with the parent or the teachers that he was connected to. He lost a lot of his friends. And the things he liked to do. So he was really isolated. And I was trying really hard to hold on to him and keep him going. And he kept telling me either I was too late or I wasn't enough. And it was really a struggle for me. And so I was telling this story to one of our staff who's experienced complex PTSD. And he told me that, well, of course, it's like we are trampolines and all of those springs are what holds that trampoline. And so it can function. And if you lose all your springs, you can't function. So at that point, I was one spring and it wasn't enough to keep him going. We're calling it spring theory, spring connection theory. Basically, we need all of our connections, just like a trampoline needs all of its springs. And if we start losing those connections, then it makes it really hard to function. And, thinking about families, you think about transitions are going to lose some of those springs, right? Classmates move on, may go to college. Maybe your children aren't doing that. As we have an elderly parent, they maybe are no longer able to read because their eyesight isn't as good as it used to be. So they're losing that. And then they've lost one of their good friends. And those things start to throw us off. So that we aren't able to function in the way that we used to be able to function. We end up more and more isolated. And the more isolated we are, again, the more those blinders come on and we don't see options. If you're a caregiver and you're trying to keep somebody from drowning, basically, they're really struggling. You may also say, well, I don't have time for my friends. I don't have time to read. I don't have time to take walks anymore. And when you do that, you're losing your springs as well. And then you can end up with secondary traumatic stress and not able to function and not able to be a good caregiver for the person that you're taking care of as well.
A good way to a good example of that is also COVID. I feel like whenever we all became very isolated, we lost a lot of our social supports. It could also be family supports as well if we couldn't visit people. And a lot of people were going through, I think they called it like long-term grief of what our life used to look like, and people couldn't really pinpoint it, but there was a lot of heightened anxiety, where people felt very helpless, that learned helplessness. So when we lose all those springs, we feel very isolated.
Yeah, so it is something definitely to start looking at, because usually if we have someone who's very at risk, we can go back and look and they've lost springs. So that really is a good indicator that if somebody starts losing those springs, we need to start rallying around them, bring those springs that they still have in their life back around them to support them so that they can start to thrive again. And I'm going to go to the next slide just because that kind of gives you an illustration here. So what springs or connection do you have in each of these categories? So just thinking about this, you can look at it as what keeps you safe, but also what keeps you connected. So, are there people That might be somebody that's really important to you. I know that I just recently started kind of visiting some of my college friends that I had totally lost track of when I had little kids because I just didn't have time, but that were important to my life. So, what are those people? It doesn't have to be people, it can be God. Are you spending that time, or did you stop going to church when COVID hit and you haven't gone back? And that was a really important part. A lot of times, a church is a community. So if you lose that, you lose more than just that service. You lose the people that you were connected to and the activities that happened as well. And then places, are there places you feel safe? Are there places that you go to connect people? And then things are touch points. What does that look like? For some people, we had a step person who had a daughter and they changed school districts. And that daughter went to the new school and she took her iPad with her. And that iPad was really, really important to her to help her feel safe and connected and in charge of herself. And the teachers saw that, and so they made it her reinforcer. And when the iPad became the reinforcer, she couldn't use it then to feel safe anymore, right? In that new setting. So sometimes those things happen in school. I know for me, I need music to regulate myself. Like if I don't have my music, I'm not, I need that like on the way home just to transition. It helps me walk through things. And when I lose that, or if somebody told me, well, you have to earn your music today, believe me, my life, I would be escalating a lot more. I might be in crisis because I didn't have that thing that I needed to keep myself at baseline. So those things are touch points are really important. And then activities, whatever that looks like, again, reading, taking a walk. I know that a couple of the young men that stayed with me told me, you need to walk because when you walk, you process, and then you can tell me what you're feeling and how you're interacting. And until then, I really couldn't. They'd say, well, what's wrong? I don't know. Go take a walk, come back, tell me what's wrong. So for me, that walking, that activity, or that music really helps me process, so that I can actually interact with what's going on. And if we've lost those springs, then what do we need to do? Again, can we rally around that person, bring the people that are really important to them, bring those connections back, and figure out how can we bridge the gap of maybe somebody's not reading. There's libraries that have tapes, books on tape. What are those other things that we can bring back that that person has lost? And that's going to help a lot with their coping, and seeing other options so that they don't have those blinders on.
No, those are all really good. And uh, this exercise is worth doing, I think, for all of us because it's just some a good self-analysis, and it really helps you start to conceptualize what safety can look like and what connection can look like. So that then I've started doing this exercise during some trainings that we offer at the ARC. And now I think about it a lot more with other people in my life, and I recognize when my partner maybe feels a little off. I kind of start thinking about these categories and see if there's maybe some support that she could benefit from or whatever it is. And so it's yeah, I think it's a useful tool to have as a lens for the world.
And I think, yeah, looking at your the people you're supporting, but not them only, look at yourself too. And, have I dropped springs because I've been so overwhelmed, or
Mm.
I've been trying to take care of this person. And I know I did that, with this young man I've been talking about. I dropped a lot of springs and it was very unhealthy for me. And so recognizing, oh wow, I needed those people around me, those things around me to be healthy. And how can I build that in? Does that mean getting some respite? Does that mean after they're going to bed that I'm connecting with people? It doesn't have to be a ton of time. Sometimes it's, I need to go to the bathroom, and while I'm in the bathroom, I'm going to scroll through Facebook for 5 minutes. We found that some of our staff really, one of their connections is to their phone. And when we say you can't have your phone at work, it's actually caused some issues for them because they don't have that thing that they're connected to. So of course, we don't want them working with their phone always there, but maybe they need a 5-minute break to check that. I also had a young man I was supporting I asked him, what like holds you here? Because I knew he had some issues in the past, and I really couldn't see a lot of things that he was doing. And he told me a schedule. Now, for me, that's kind of tenuous, but I mean, he had that schedule, he followed it every day, and to him, it was really important. And that was his main spring, was that schedule. But it maybe there's springs that you're not even thinking of. So don't like say, oh, well, it wasn't in one of those categories, it's not really a spring. But think about, think out of the box. What else is holding that person? What's really important to them?
I think also about how having connections, having springs in all of these spheres is A, important for functioning, but B, it is also part of having a more self-actualized, high quality life, and that if we are really looking to do that ourselves and help other people around us do that, then making sure there is something in each of these categories is a big piece of it.
I'm going to go to the next piece because this for me, so we read a book on disability and what was it? Disability and mental illness, Leanna?
Trauma,
I lost it.
trauma and NIDD.
Trauma, yes, trauma and disability. And one of the things that they said for resilience is that we need these things. And I've actually added one, but I think interacting with these, so we need connection to other people, which I just talked about with the spring thing. Safety, we need that, and we've talked about that with Maslow, right? We need to feel safe, we need to feel supported, and then we need to feel empowered, be able to make decisions on our own, be able to do things we want to do. And then we need to be able to set boundaries so that we have downtime or we can make choices about what other people are doing in our lives. So all of those pieces, and if we start thinking about that, it's not really a balanced thing all the time. So let's say that I want to make connection with somebody or maybe even date somebody. I may have to give up a little of my safety to make that connection. But note that if I'm really uncomfortable, I need to be aware, hey, I might have given up a little of the safety and maybe I need to look at that. We had somebody who was being really empowered. They got a new job. They were really excited. It was their dream job, but they had to ride the bus to get to that dream job. And they had had an incident on the bus years before, and they were very uncomfortable on the bus. And so when they were getting to work, even though it was the perfect job they wanted, they didn't feel safe on the bus. It was causing problems at work. We may have to look at, we have really strict boundaries, but in order to connect with somebody, I need to change what those boundaries are. So all of these interplay, and they definitely make us look at things differently. And maybe if we're feeling unbalanced, it's because we haven't even realized we've compromised on one of these. Right now, I'm still playing with this, but I like the 4 because I can remember them on my fingers. Safety, connection, empowerment, boundaries. And boundaries, by the way, do not mean we're expecting somebody else to change. Boundaries are, I'm going to do something that keeps that boundary. So if this happens, I'm going to leave the room. I'm making a change so that I'm supported, not that I'm expecting anybody else to make a change.
All right. If anybody has attended trainings with Sharon Spurlock, I'm sure you have seen this before. This is the life trajectory. So talking about a vision for a good life. So what would you want? I always like to ask people, like, where do you see your life in the next 2 years? What do you want in the next 2 years? And if that's hard to think about, the next month. And then what I don't want. So earlier, I was working with somebody who has a lot of anxiety about going places. So we wanted to talk a little bit about, where do you want to go? Who have you not seen because of this? So a vision for their good life was seeing their family, going to do activities that they used to, and something that they didn't want was not having as much anxiety. And then in this arrow, you can do, how would you get there? So little steps like that. So I guess my vision for a good life, I think I would love to have a car that works in the next year. So I think my vision for a good life would be, I would like a car that works. I would like to be unpacked in my house. So, and what I don't want is my car to keep breaking down, um, for things to continue to be in boxes and to have anxiety because of it. So I think on wait, this is a very simplified version also. So ways to get that vision for my good life is to one by one, and unpacking gives me a lot of anxiety. So really, I think for me, taking it baby steps. So maybe do 3 boxes a day of unpacking. And whenever I tell people for baby steps for having anxiety and doing something that might be triggering, kind of like this person that was struggling to leave the house, we have baby steps and also coping mechanisms along with it, that we've worked on that are specific to them. But for me, it's baby steps and doing little tiny tasks. So I'm able to break it down. And for a working car, trying to take my car in for little maintenances here and there and slowly building up to try to get it fully functioning. And what I don't want is to have anxiety about all of this. So I think really trying to focus on mental health and thinking about the spring theory and making sure I'm trying to get all those supports in different areas of my life can be really helpful. I won't just put off packing. I tend to do that. So really trying to do a task every day, even if it's the smallest task, if it's half a box, that's okay. So really trying to focus on, I think this really focuses on, okay, this is what I don't want. How can I prevent that? Which is really helpful because sometimes it's really hard to think about what do I want in a year or a month. If anybody would like to add anything, they're welcome to.
Yeah, and a lot of times if you don't do anything, you end up with what you don't want, right?
Yes. Yes.
But sometimes I also think about this, what do I want? What are the things I need to do to get there? But also underneath that arrow, what's holding me back? Is there anything that I'm not thinking about that's holding me back? And it's like I want to work out every night, but I get home, I'm tired. So, but if I keep in mind, hey, this is my end result, I'm more likely to do that than if I'm just coming home and going, oh, I'm tired, right?
Oh, I
So
like
that
that.
vision is always good.
And I think one of your examples of what builds a good life for you is one where some of the methods to get there could really translate to a lot of people because in some ways, it's a financially based goal, right? Like having a functioning car means having the financial resources to keep it up or to replace it. And that is something that so many of us have life goals around that just life costs money, including the people, our loved ones with disabilities, right? And so having goals, that help us think about financial wellness and be working towards something is motivational, but then also breaking down our long-term goal into finance that are feasible is another direction to take that and to really break down saving $50 a month for repairs or $25 a month for a vacation in a year or new gaming, whatever the things are, or to take some classes at college, like whatever somebody's dreams are. There are ways to break down some of those financial pieces into a bigger picture of wellness that is meaningful.
Yes. Love it. Baby steps.
Yes. And always keeping that what I want in mind, right? Because if you don't have that, if you never sit down and do this, and this is for everybody, this is not, everybody needs to do this. What do I want? And then you can motivate yourself to get there. Because if you're not sitting down and saying, what do I want? You're not going to take steps to get to it.
Yes.
And sometimes there's good, if you can find good programs out there also that are a good fit, sometimes they build it in. Like our leisure department right now has a program running for folks who might be interested in participating in a triathlon. And so to do that, there are 6 weeks worth of Saturdays built in to get together and train together, right? And so these sometimes there are goals like this that can be done in community, and that is also a meaningful part of it. That connection, the springs that help you also reach your goals, I think can be, also a motivational way to make them happen.
I like
Yeah,
that.
I think about, I've been a part of a book group for like 20 years and
Yeah.
and we we meet once a month and we don't actually talk about the book that much because we pass like 5 around a month, but it's nice because I have this motivation. Hey, do you want the book? It's on my, doorstep, and we get that social time. So it's reinforcing in a couple different ways.
Totally.
And we do reading groups or book groups. Our leisure department has those as well.
So the Integrated Support Star, again, if you guys have attended any life course trainings with Sharon Spurlock or gotten navigation, you've probably seen this. So the Integrated Support Star, you usually want to put a goal in the middle, and then you think about what ways in your community and life can be supportive in this goal. So relationships, it might be family, friends, neighbors, coworkers. We want to think about eligibility specific. So if somebody wants to live somewhere, what eligibility parameters? So like if somebody wanted to live in the homes at the Ark, they have some eligibility requirements. And then community-based, where can you go in your community to find more information about this or access supports? And then we also have technology. Technology can be a beautiful thing when it works, as we're saying with our links not working, apologies. But we have a wonderful way to access technology and information around us, and then personal strengths and assets. So you really want to think also, what are you good at? What are you going to be happy with? And what kind of opportunities have you taken? Which can be really helpful. And Sue gave a really good example of, I think it was dinner, right? Or what did you want to
Yeah,
do?
what do I want for dinner? Because my husband and I tend to go to the same like 3 restaurants. So like you get in these, and I think that happens with a lot of things. Where are we going to go this weekend? We're going to go to the same 3 places. What, we again get those blinders on just because that's what we do. So yeah, you can put anything in the middle of the star, and one of them is, what am I going to eat for dinner tonight?
Yes. Because your relationships, who are you going to get food with?
And I'm sure I could
anyway?
show up in my mom's house tonight and she would probably feed me, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then
So,
eligibility specific. I guess.
if I was older, I could go get Meals on Wheels maybe, or maybe there's, if I needed to, I didn't have financial means, I might be able to be to qualify for a food pantry, something like that.
Or because I live in my neighborhood, Sue, do you have like a neighborhood Facebook group that is for the neighborhood that you live in?
Yes.
And so that often I'll find on mine that people sometimes do pantry cleanouts, and they'll just offer up food that they're about to get rid of, and you can go to a porch pickup and that kind of thing. That's which is relationships and technology also, but also because I am eligible because I live in this neighborhood, so I can connect with these people. And that's a really helpful thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. And then community-based, that's a huge part. Georgia, I feel like yours was also eligibility and community-based, where you live in that community, and what's close to you, what bus system might be able to pick you up as well to go get that food.
Yep. Definitely. There might be a fish fry going on because we are in St. Louis, so you never know. It might be worth walking to the local Catholic parish, seeing if they got something going.
All the options. And then technology. Are you going to be using your phone to get an Uber or use Call a Ride? Are you going to get on Google to see what kind of food you want and what's open? So this can be really, and then yes, yeah.
All the delivery options.
Yes. And then personal strengths and assets. So a personal strength might be you're a foodie and you know your food. So that's a personal strength with dinner. You might have a food allergy, so you know what kind of food that you need to avoid. Anybody else want to add anything for the star?
The one thing I would add is that you don't have to have this star around all the time. You have 5 fingers, so if you can just remember those 5 pieces, you can do that problem solving with anybody. But it's just basically opening up your thought process and thinking about what else is going on, who else can I ask what I need to do. So it opens up those doors that you're stuck in that rut or that routine. Gives you other options for what you can do.
I think it's a good tool to use also, certainly on topic for our presentation for safety challenges that arise, if someone's looking for somewhere safe to stay, or if someone is having a particular type of crisis a lot, and you're trying to identify ways to relieve a certain trigger, you could go through some of these areas and look at resources. It certainly useful in ways that you wouldn't think it would be, but it's very concrete, and it pushes you to stop and really think, and don't stop at the first one or two ideas. Really, really push to get a kind of a long list in that category, and you'll be surprised what strategies you come up with.
And sometimes the answer is so simple. So we didn't really use the STAR at this point. It's been several years ago, but I had somebody who I knew he really wanted a job. There was no question in my mind that he really wanted to work. But every time he got a job, he sabotaged it, and we couldn't figure out what was going on. And his whole support team was sitting around a table talking to him. And somebody just grabbed a piece of paper and said, "Okay, what do you like about the jobs you've had? And what don't you like?" And he said, "Well, I want to wear a uniform. I don't want to think about what I'm wearing." And then he said, "I hate working in the morning."
Mhm.
And I think like all of our mouths dropped open because he wanted to work in a restaurant. It's really easy to get a restaurant job at night, probably easier. And here, every job we had gotten, he started in the morning. And of course, he was sabotaging them, but none of us had asked him because we don't know. We just
Hadn't
didn't.
even
None of
occurred
us
to you. Yeah.
realized. And he kept that next job. He was a busser in a restaurant. He loved it. He worked there for years. But it was such a simple thing, and we were all just floored that we didn't know. And of course, he was sabotaging. So this STAR can help you with things like that too, where oh wow, I didn't know that. And it's a big piece for this person. So if you have any questions that we didn't answer, I'm going to leave this email up, but please at this point, ask us questions. We're glad to answer. Hey, Georgia, do we want to say anything about what's coming up with mental health? Or is
Sure.
that, yeah. So we have gotten a grant to look at mental health and people in disability, and have some instructors that can teach mental health first aid. And that'll be something that's coming up starting in November for the 2 years after that. So just so you're aware that is coming, what that's going to look like, we're still figuring out. And then there's also another piece called skills system that can look at some systems for helping people who are trying to learn how to make decisions and get some support. And that's something Leanna will probably look at more in her counseling as well. So we're excited, and we're not there yet. We're still, we haven't been trained. We haven't put together adaptations for the curriculum yet, but it's coming.
We're very excited.
Yeah, thanks for that comment just now as well. I'm glad the timing was good. Sometimes the universe looks out for us.
Oh, I'm happy you were able to come. I just read the comment. Thanks for attending.
Yeah, so glad.
And reach out anytime.